Okay, so I'm going to do the a demo for this workshop. If we look at this, this is the repo that, excuse me, this is the deployment, and this is what our results should be. And we could go and start setting this up. So what I'm going to do is first open up a new terminal here. And let's go ahead and I'm going to name this, let's see, make directory, and we'll call this Acme-PreWork-Demo. And I'm going to go ahead and cd into it. Notice here that you have, there's actually two commands here, and notice you have the two ampersands here because you want this to complete. And this is shorthand for the directory that ended up getting created here. And now this will just take me into this directory. So what I want to do here is I want to set up Webpack. And we could go ahead and set that up by specifying npm install. And actually, before I do that, since I want this stuff to be saved locally, if I look at this, I'll see that I have nothing in here. So I'm going to do my npm init. And I'm going to do a flag of Y, and this will actually just give me the default settings for npm init. And now, if I look over here, I'll see that I've got my package.json file, and I'm going to install a couple of different things here. I'm going to install Webpack. I'm going to install Babel Core. I'm going to install Babel Loader, and I'm also going to install Babel Preset ES 2015. And from what I understand, there was a time where all these npm modules were packaged together. Now they're actually set up separately. So again, a little bit of work here to set up our Webpack. Not a ton of work here. And I'm actually, for this, I'm not even going to set up a server because I'm just going to open this file as a regular file in the file system. And that'll work for what we're doing here. So once this ends up getting installed, what I'm going to do is put a task in my package.json. I'm going to open up my editor of choice. Again, if I look over here, I'll see that now I've got my node modules folder. I'm going to open up my editor, which in my case is going to be Vim. And if I go over here, I can see I've got a bunch of node modules here, which ended up getting installed. And if I look at my package.json, what I'm going to do, let me actually just show you a couple things here. If I go and actually run Webpack, and by the way, I don't have Webpack installed globally. If you did, this would actually give you something. I don't have it installed globally, so what I'm going to do is go to my node modules. I know that it's in Webpack. Webpack has a bin folder. Within that, I've got my Webpack.js. So if I just did this, what would happen? I'd get an error message, and it would say output file name is not configured. So one of the things that you could do here, just as an example, if I was to go over here and create a directory called source and put an index.js file here, and I was to go over here and say console.log foo, so now I've got this JavaScript file. I can actually run Webpack from the command line by putting in this command and specifying /source index. And if you look at the documentation for Webpack, you'll see that this will basically be the entry point. And now I have to give an output file. So I'll say dist bundle.js. And what will happen here is that this will run, and I'll actually get that dist folder. And if I opened up that dist folder, I would see I've got this bundle.js. And again, this is going to allow me to, all this sort of boilerplate code here is going to allow me to load modules with this require JS pattern in the browser, which is something that you normally wouldn't have. It's going to allow me to bundle my files together. It's going to be do a lot of different things for us. We're going to use it to bundle our files and we're going to use Babel to output to transpile our files. So it's important to make this distinction. The Webpack is going to bundle our files. Babel is going to be used to process our files. So things we could do with Babel would be, an example is to take this ES6 code and make it so that it's ES5 compatible and it ends up working in all browsers. So one other thing I'm going to do here is that I don't want to have to keep on running this command. Instead, what I'm going to do is go over to my package.json, and I'm going to create a webpack command. I could call this whatever I want to. I'm calling it webpack because I'm using webpack in this command. And I'm going to go node modules, webpack, bin, webpack.js. And what this will do is that, again, by default, if I go over here and I specify npm run webpack, it'll actually run that script file. It'll look in that package.json file, it'll find that, and I'll get this error message, which, again, it doesn't know my file name, and this is where the webpack config ends up coming in. So if you don't want to use command line arguments, we could go over here, webpack config.js. There's really only two things that we're going to need right off the bat, and this is going to be our entry, which is going to be /source index.js, and our output, which is going to be an object. The object is going to have a path, and this path is going to be /dist, and the file name is going to be bundle. So if I go to run this now, this should do the same thing that it did before. And let's just do one other thing here, which is going to make our life a little bit easier. I'm going to do another command called webpack watch. Why separate these things out? Well, I'll tell you the reason for it is that when I deploy this, I might want to run these things separately. Sometimes I might just want to run webpack and have it process our files. And sometimes I might want to run webpack and I might want it to have it watch our files so that every time we make a change, it repacks these files. So there's nothing that prevents us from going in here and saying, hey, look, we want to run webpack. And to the underlying command, we want to pass a watch flag. So what this is going to do is it's going to call webpack, and it's going to send to the underlying command of webpack.js the watch flag. So now if I run npm, by the way, if you want to know what you can run from npm run, just type npm run. And you could see that you could run webpack watch, and let's run that. We're going to run webpack watch, npm run webpack watch. You can't forget the run. Now, when that runs, it's going to basically be looking for changes. So every time that I went in here, and just to sort of see this in action, if you look over on the bottom of the screen here, if I go over to source, and I change this foo to bar, you'll see that that ends up getting rebuilt. So that's just a starting point for setting up webpack. And next up, we'll actually add it so that we can end up using ES6 syntax. And that'll end up transpiling into ES5. So now what I want to do here is I want to go and modify my webpack. I'm going to start off by actually going back here, and this is the code that I want to use. So I'm going to copy this stuff. I'm going to paste it in. I'm going to comment out lines as I go along, but this is kind of what I'm working towards. And this is what I want to have here. And actually, even before we do that, let me actually backtrack a little bit. Just so we can see where we're headed here. What I'm going to do is put in a index.html file, and I'll go over here, and I'm going to put a head and a body. It's really going to be nothing in the body, but what I'm going to do for my source is I want to have a script tag, and I want the source to be /dist bundle.js. And this, very simplistically, to not really even have a web server, but just to see the results of what this ends up getting us. If I go back to my terminal here, I've got my watch running here. I'm just going to open up a new tab. And I'm just going to specify open dot, and this will actually open up my Finder. And just by clicking on index.html, it'll open up in a web browser. And if I go over here, I'll see my console.log on the right. And just to see that this is watching correctly, if I go over here and I change this to hello, and that should rerun. Let's just see if that's actually running. You actually saw my mistake. I inadvertently made a mistake here in my Webpack config. For some reason I do this a little bit too much. I need to put an extension on here. And now let me go back and change that. Let me kill this and restart it because it's actually outputting to a file that I'm not using. I was wondering why the output wasn't what I expected. Now if I go back here, I'll see hello. And if I go over here and change this to foo, I'll see foo. Now what I'm going to do next is go over here, and I am going to go and copy this stuff in here. I'll comment a bunch of it out as I do it. But we're going to want to use ES6 syntax to do importing. So different ways to import things. You have the require syntax, but you also have the ES6 syntax. Again, two different ways to do things. The advantage of the ES6, from what I see, is you could sort of name things that you want to export. You could just sort of pull in what you want from different modules. And again, this is stuff that we'll be covering a little bit later on. I'm going to comment a bunch of this stuff out here that I don't need for the moment. So let's see if it'll let me do this. And if I go back here and I rerun this, let's just take a look. So this ends up actually outputting, but there's nothing really that's happening here. And in fact, let's just see what happens if we end up going and running it. Right, we end up getting this syntax error. If we were to go in here and look at our bundle, we would see that we're using import, and import doesn't quite work in the browser. So what we want to do is we want to use our ES6. And just a couple of extra steps here in terms of the Webpack. If we go in here, we could specify we've got a module, and a module has a loaders property. Loaders property is an array, because you could have several loaders. And what we're going to specify here is that we're going to test and say if a file ends with JS, we're going to use a loader of Babel. That's where the Babel loader ends up coming in. And we could also specify that we want to use one of our presets, and that's done with this query flag, and we could say presets, and we could say ES 2015. Now again, if that's installed, which it should be here, because we installed that at the beginning, and I go back here, I could go ahead and find, if I scroll down, here's my Babel, here's my preset 2015, and again, since I modified my config file, even though I have a watch there, that's not respecting the config file changes. So if I go in here, rerun this, this should run. So now I actually get a little bit of a different error message that it can't find the Acme-DB. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to go in my source file. So this is going to be looking for Acme-DB, modify add, Acme-DB.js. And we can see that that ends up compiling. And in fact, if I go to rerun this, I had a error before that was showing up. That error should end up going away. Again, we're not outputting anything, but the next step will actually go in and implement this code, which we should be able to do relatively quickly. So now let's go and implement these methods. So in terms of the ES6 export system or import system, depending on what side you're on, what we're going to do here is we're going to have a class. We'll call it Acme-DB. This is how we end up doing a class. and we'll specify export default Acme-DB. So this will end up exporting this class. If we went back over here, now we could actually uncomment this line, and if we did a console.log of db, we'd probably just see that we have an object with some properties, assuming that this runs. And again, we don't really have all that much here. Not too much going on in this prototype because we really haven't done too much with it. But let's actually go and start implementing this. So it's specifying that we should have a users.length. So let's actually go over here. Again, we'll do this one at a time. We just wanted to get this to show up with a value of 1. We could go over here. And what we're going to do here is we're going to use our constructor. So with ES6 classes, you can use a constructor. And I'm passing in users. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull out users because I'm passing in an object. And I want to pull out the users from it. I could actually grab the whole object if there were multiple things that were here. Again, so a couple of ES6 goodies here. This is the equivalent of doing this. You don't have to do it. And I'm going in and I'm just pulling this out. It saves a couple of keystrokes. If I wanted to see that, I could say console.log users. But right now I'm just passing that in, but I'm not doing anything with it. So I'll get an error message here that specifies here are my users, but I'm not doing anything with them. If I just wanted to get this not to blow up, I could go over here and say this.users equals users, in which case I'd have a length of 1. What if I go back here to my index and move this down here? What I want to do is I want this to have an ID of 1. This is actually probably most of the work that's in here, and this is giving me undefined. So what do I really want to do here? A number of different ways to do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify that I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to specify this.users map, and what am I going to do with each user? And I'll go over here and I'll specify add user, because that's another method we're going to have to create of user. And actually what I want to do here is I want to say this add user. Now this is, again, a big advantage of using ES6. Let's actually put this in. We'll say add user. And we'll go over here. We could actually do this maybe in a little bit of a different way if we want to reuse this. So here's our user. If we were to go over here and just return user, we'd pretty much be in the same boat as we were before. Let's just make sure that we don't have any errors here when we do that. That seemed to run, and this should give me the same thing that I have here. Can't read map of undefined, and that's because I actually want to do not this users, because I don't have a this users yet. And what I really probably want to do to make my life a little bit easier is that instead of mapping over the users, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say users for each. So I'm going to iterate over the users, right? That's what the for each does. And for every user that I iterate over, I'm going to add a user. When I end up getting in here, I'm going to say this.users equals an empty user. So this is going to hold my users, and then I'm going to add my users here. And if I want it to be, again, in the same boat that I was in before, this.users.push user. Not incredibly helpful there. This is just going to give me the same thing that I had before. But we'll work our way around to actually adding the user where we should see an ID of 1 here. How are we going to do that? What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a reduce function. And the way that I'm going to use the reduce function is to do a let. And I'm going to say max ID. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and loop over all of my users. And I'm going to use a reduce. And for each of my users, what I'm going to pass in here is this function here. So I'm going to end up doing a reduce, and we'll specify user. And this is going to be a function. And you could look at see how reduce works, but we're actually going to start with 0. And in fact, when we use the reduce function, there's 2 parameters that we end up passing in here. So my first parameter is going to be what I'm going to be calling my max. My second parameter is going to be this function. And let me just take a look. I think I'm doing this incorrectly. So reduce takes a function, which is here, and a starting point. So when this ends up getting called, what's going to happen with reduce is that it's going to come in here, and it's going to call reduce. Sometimes you could actually, if you're used to ES5, you might be able to write this out a little bit simpler. But what I'm going to do here, once I get in here, I'm going to just ask the question. So again, this is going to run for as many users as we have. We have none. If I was to go over here and just show you this, we actually don't have any users that are going to come in here at all. And let's just see if this is correct. This actually gives me a value of 0, which is kind of what I was expecting. What I want to do here is that I want to specify that if the ID of the user is greater than my max, and this is going to happen once we start adding users, what I'm going to specify is max equals user ID, and I'm going to return max. So what this is going to end up doing, if I had a user in here, and we'll see this as we start adding multiple users, I'm going to end up getting a max ID. And what I'll do here is I'll specify, hey, look, user.id, and we're going to say ++ max ID. So again, if this started out at 0, when we add the user, once the user gets added, we'll end up having an ID of 1, which we have here. And I think this will become a little bit more clear once we go here and we add another user. And if I do this, I'm going to get that same result, but just for the sake of argument, to see this, I'm going to say console.log db users. And if you look at this, you'll see that I've got 2 users over here. My reduce function ran, but there was nothing in here, so Mo gets an ID of 1. Larry ends up getting an ID of 2. And let's just implement one more method here. We'll actually do we're going to actually do the show users, which doesn't exist yet. This is a pretty simple one. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my Acme DB. Add users, probably one of the harder functions here. Show users. And all this is going to do is I want to go ahead here and I'm going to return this .users, and I'm going to map. What am I going to map? See, if I only have one parameter here for ES6, I don't need to put the parentheses. When I have 2 parameters, I do need those parentheses. And I'll go over here and I'm just going to return user.name. This gives me an array, and I'm going to join the array on a comma. So now when I ask to show users, I should see that I've got Mo and Larry, and if I wanted to have a space, actually I think I'm just doing a space delimited list, so let's actually just join it by a space. If I go here, that will end up working, and we could sort of motor along with some of these other methods that we're going to add here. We've got find by ID. So find by ID, we're going to use, again, we could use other libraries that help us deal with collections, but we're going to use some of the methods that are available to us already. So if we do find by ID, here, of course, we'll get a big fat error message because find by ID doesn't exist. But if we go back over here, we could specify find by ID. This is going to be an ID. And what are we going to do here? I'm going to specify filtered equals this .users.filter, and we're going to get a user, and we'll say we're going to filter you when your ID is equal to the ID that was passed in. So this gives us an array. It's important to note that it's a new array. We're not modifying users. Filter doesn't modify, map doesn't modify, for each doesn't modify anything. And what we're doing is we're going to take this filtered array and we'll just say if filter.length, meaning we ended up finding one of these, we're just going to return filtered 0. So again, you see all these different array methods that we're using here. Actually, we're using all of them. Really, we're using a for each, we're using a reduce, we're using a map, and we're using a filter. And now, if we run this, we'll see that we get Larry. So we're definitely getting there. And we could also add a user. Should work as well. Shouldn't break anything, which is good. But now we're actually going to go and we're going to want to remove the first user. So we don't have this method yet. There's also a real easy one with the filter. So if we want to remove a user by ID, pretty simple thing to do here. We've got find by ID. It's all like a mini database, a little CRUD database here. Remove by ID. We're going to pass. Let's just remove by ID. Obviously, it's going to remove by ID. And real simply, we just say, hey, look, this dot users equals this dot users dot filter. And we're going to look at each of you users. And we'll look, if your ID is not equal to the ID that was passed in, we want you. Otherwise, we have no need for you. And if we run that, remove user by ID, okay. Not too consistent here, but let's do that. Remove user by ID. We're going to end up filtering the users. Again, filter gives us a new array, and we assign it to this users. So now this gives us Larry. And if we end up going back here, actually, this will give us Larry. We remove users by ID. And if we go over here, we should see that since we ended up removing Mo, we should see that the first user is now going to be Larry, which it is. Okay. So the last thing we want to do is we want to go here and we want to edit a user. This is also pretty simplistic here. This doesn't exist yet. But we'll go over here and we'll specify. So when we edit a user, we're going to actually pass the user in here. And if we do this, edit user, and here, real simply, we're going to do the same thing we did before with one modification. And we're not going to filter. What we're going to do is use map instead. And we'll specify for each user. Now again, since this is not a one-liner, I could turn it into a one-liner, but if you had multiple lines for your function, that's fine. You could end up putting it here. And what we're going to do here is when we go to map, we'll specify, we're going to pass in a user here. So here, I don't want this name of this user to conflict with this user. So over here, if I wanted to, I could put edited user. And I'll say if edited user ID is equal to the user's ID, then when I do my mapping, return edited user. And I see I seem to do this quite a bit. Edited user ID. It's the ID property. Otherwise, and in fact, since that's a return, we probably don't have to do an otherwise. But here we'll specify that if this is not the case, we're just going to return the user. So what we're doing here is we're just replacing whatever was the edited user here with, in fact, the edited user. And we don't get an error here, but let's just see that that's correct. It's an easy one to go in here and look at. When we show users, we should see that Larry has a different strange spelling. And that ends up working as well. So that pretty much completes this exercise. You could see you're not really dealing with a ton of code here. I wanted to get you comfortable with using Webpack and using ES6 syntax. And in the process of doing this, you could see you're using a lot of these different array methods. Again, things to understand is that these methods don't end up modifying an array. They end up giving you a new array. and you're using this with the arrow syntax. Out of all these methods, the one that's probably the trickiest is reduce. And again, I wasn't really all that used to using it with ES6, so I had to go through and do it. Took my time doing it here. But again, when you think about this, is that map basically gives you a new array of the same length as whatever the array was before. Filter gives you a new array. Could be the same length. There could be nothing in it. Who knows? And reduce basically is transforming your array. Here, we're just transforming our array into an integer value, but you could imagine you could do any sort of reduce that you wanted to go and basically reduce an array or a collection into any other type of object, whether it's another array, whether it's an object, whether it's a number, or whether or not it's a true or false value. It's really up to what your logic is. And that, I think, does it.